Hey, so we are going to start today's lesson with a video starting the conversation about totalitarianism. We're going to be defining totalitarianism in the next slide, but we're going to talk also about Mussolini. This PowerPoint in general will deal with Mussolini, Hitler, and Stalin. Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin. And we're going to talk about those guys in great detail. So make sure you're taking notes. I really hope you guys are ready to roll with this. But that's what we're going to talk about. Our first one's going to be about Mussolini. All right, guys, I love this image about totalitarianism. It really speaks so loudly to me what totalitarianism is. I'll come back to that in a second. But in general, what is totalitarianism? I want to point out it's 20th century autocracy. It is a dictatorship, typically led by a cult of personality. A cult of personality is an individual who's able to utilize charisma to create a movement around him or her. Cults of personality create movements, and people. These cults of personality become so substantial that people begin to believe that this personality alone is their future. And really, the reason this is going to happen is primarily because of propaganda, media, the development of psychology, everything we've talked about so far. Totalitarianism is a police state. The use of secret police and regular police to create an amount of fear to force individuals into submission. In some ways, this is similar to the reign of terror that we saw in France during the French Revolution, but it's much more organized. Government control over all aspects of the state. They'll oversee the factors of production. Even in the when we look at the idea of the rightist totalitarianism, fascist Nazism, though they do support the bourgeoisie, they use the bourgeoisie to establish moral standards, if you will, but they still oversee those factors of production. The leftist that we're going to talk about tomorrow is communism, which is under Stalin. And we're going to see how all that plays out. We're going to be able to compare and contrast, I hope, before we get done with our tomorrow's lesson. But that's what we got. I do like this image. They're going to use religion, economics, education, family, and media to consolidate power. And I hope you see this as we go through. Now we're going to look at Mussolini and fascist Italy. This is Italy in 1938. And look what they say here. It's the Italian Empire. And again, this is kind of what it's about. Italia Redenta. It's about this romance. Do you guys remember what that country is called? Albania. And we'll see how that happens later in the next chapter. But let's go ahead and get started. All right, Mussolini's rise. And again, you guys have already read about it. You read about how he was an elementary teacher. He was a socialist. But during World War I, that nationalistic kind of clique came in, and he was dying for World War I and aggrandizement and size, growth, excellence, social Darwinism. So right after World War I and the failure, he forms the fascists, right? The League of Combat, I think, was the Italian term for it. And we see this. And the fascists, I want to point out, fascists, they're ultra nationalists. It's all about Italy, Italy, Italy. And Mussolini begins to promise the middle class that he's going to create a new Italy. He's going to make people proud to be Italian. He utilized mass politics to promise the middle class that he would prevent a communist revolution. And he basically said, if I'm elected, I will make Italy great. And they might say, hey, how are you going to do this? Well, you're going to elect me. What are you going to do? Make Italy great. How are you going to do it if you elect me? He never explained the plan. And again, that's substantial for you to understand that when I look at Mussolini, he's not ideologically driven as maybe a Hitler is. And we'll see that. He used the black shirts and political violence. And this is actually a photograph of the black shirts. These weren't official guys. And these guys are just carrying guns. They're walking around. They're beating up people. They're terrorizing people. They're threatening people. And you might say, well, wouldn't people be like against them? It was one of those things, if you can't beat them, you should join them. And Mussolini is going to use this violence in the 1920s, in the early 1920s, to really gain a movement. By the end of 1922, the middle-class Italians were convinced that Mussolini would provide law and order necessary for the rise of a new Italy. They feared communism. They feared Bolshevism. They feared, and just think about it, guys. It's a weakened democracy. Italy came out of World War I with not what they promised. They didn't really win any significant battles. Italy was a hot mess, and they now want a father figure, a cult of personality, Mussolini, to put it all together. And Mussolini's he's a threat in a coup. And again, once again, it's kind of weird how this happens, right? In the fall of 1922, Mussolini begins to say, "Hey, we're going to call for a seizure of power, a coup d'état." The black shirts, it's not that he's trying to. He would say, "Hey, I'm not trying to control them, but if they do it, I'll come in, I'll save the day." Well, that's when King Victor Emmanuel III began to go, "Oh no, how are we going to do this?" Little side note, Italy did have the power to quash the black shirts, but I think Victor Emmanuel III feared that if he quashed the black shirts, he would be weakened and that a communist revolution might take place. So they would rather have a far right Mussolini than a threat of communism. So he invites Mussolini to be prime minister. The hope is Giolitti. Remember that Giolitti, the guy that did Transformissimo, that he's a powerful politician and that he's going to be the vice chancellor, vice prime minister, and they're hoping that they can control him. Well, once he gains power, they still have this march on Rome, and I think maybe some of you guys messed up this on the thing on Friday. He becomes prime minister and then has the march on Rome. The March on Rome occurs. It's a romantic moment to illustrate Mussolini coming in and becoming the prime minister. And here is a kind of a photograph that will be used later to define it. Remember, guys, Mussolini has become part of the government. But what he's going to do later, he's going to use this moment in the textbooks to say this was a coup d'etat. Mussolini used the threat of violence to the state, becomes the prime minister, and now is in the driver's seat. Now he's gained power, but how's he going to have that coup d'etat or the seizure of power? And here's the final steps. The Acerbo Law. The Acerbo Law, really a ridiculous law, but it guaranteed that the fascists, if they win 25% of the vote in the next election, they would be secured 67% of the seats in parliament. You need to make sure, I think some of you are like, I'm not sure why that's important. 67% of the vote is necessary to get rid of the Constitution. So the Acerbo Law is used by Mussolini to guarantee that he'll have the ability to destroy the democracy. And the Italian people were okay with it. The reason the politicians passed this law is that the black shirts literally threatened them. If I'm a socialist and I'm like, I don't believe in this law is a tool to get rid of democracy. Well, the black shirts would visit me and maybe break my knee. And I would then, of course, vote for it. So political violence was still there. In the election of 1924, he secured enough seats to do that. He used the supermajority to suspend the Italian constitution. And by 1925, Mussolini is Il Duce. That's a I, capital I, Il Duce. And Il Duce, the leader, he has successfully suspended the Italian Constitution and has gained power. I love this photograph. It kind of shows you these are thousands of people in which Mussolini is going to use the microphone to speak to them. I just want to make sure you understand this is a very 20th century moment. This can never have happened in this way because the microphone is going to be able to utilize speakers throughout that. People are going to feel like he's speaking to them through the electronic. Really important aspect. And Mussolini immediately begins to consolidate power. Consolidating power means to bring it under one power. He controlled the state media and propaganda. And I want to fix that. You'll have that fixed in a second. State media and propaganda. He began to convey messages. What's the most famous statement? Mussolini is always right. That became a state slogan. Then you have the secret police that are used to identify teenagers, to identify 20-year-olds, adults, people who might be in opposition to Mussolini's rule, and they would end up disappearing. The cult of motherhood, and this is propaganda right here. The propaganda here, cult of motherhood is going to be used to really to attack the new woman. The new woman, Montessori, that's a bad person. They've created chaos. What do we need to do? We need the woman to come out of the workforce. We need the woman to stay at home. We need the woman to have babies because that is what the right thing does. And he creates medals. I want to point out the big thing about this is the reason he does this is he immediately reduces the unemployment rate. The only people that are considered unemployed are people looking for jobs. Once the women came out of the workforce, they no longer were unemployed. And that's really the reason for it. He used Catholicism. He brought an end to the conflict, right? We know that this goes all the way back to Garibaldi and the threat of Rome. Italy was a secular state. Well, what happens here? Mussolini ends that conflict. The Lateran Accords. The Pope is able to recognize Italy as a secular state, and Mussolini gives the Church Vatican City, the smallest independent state in the world. But he also states that that there's no more religious toleration. Italy has a singular religion, Catholicism. He's really going to build upon this. What is a good Italian? A good Italian is a fascist. A good Italian is a military soldier. A good Italian is an industrial worker if he's a man. A good Italian, if a woman is at home making babies. These are the things that make a good, and a good Italian is Catholic. So by the time we step out into 1930, Mussolini, he has convinced the people that Italy was on the rise, that he alone represented the greatness. He does this he really fails to solve any of the economic problems. He doesn't have an ideological base. It's all hype, it's all emotion, it's all rhetoric. There's no real solutions. And unfortunately for Mussolini, this is going to be really his downfall by the time we get to the end of into the 1940s. He focused on the development of a police state and militarism. And really, anytime there's an economic decline, he expanded the military. He wanted to employ the men in the military. When the Depression hit, Italy's future was squarely in the hands of Mussolini. The democracy was over with, and Mussolini alone represented the greatness. And that's going to be where we are, right? And that's kind of what we are, what we want to see. So I wanted to point out, you have that assignment that's attached to this. I hope that you saw that the chart, how Mussolini has utilized emotions, utilized rhetoric, mass politics, consolidated power, and now he's kind of patchworking it, and we'll see how that plays out later.